Hello, everyone. Good evening, and welcome to you all for the 10th episode of Inside Out. My guest tonight has had a stellar career in the corporate world. He is currently a leadership coach, and he's also authored books which have been bestsellers. It's my pleasure to present to you Prakash Iyer. Welcome, Prakash. How are things?
Good, WV. And thanks for having me here.
The interesting thing about your books is that you have a knack of conveying key messages through engrossing anecdotes, be it sport or be it life. You always try and make it a point to convey your points by narrating and clubbing it with some interesting stories.
So I think I just enjoy it, and I think stories are powerful. I have personally found that if you tell somebody, you can either give him 5 points of theory and it'll all go over his head, or you can tell him a little story and it'll probably stick in his mind. And I quite enjoy it myself. And over time, I guess that's what I do. I tell stories, and I hope that somebody will get some use out of it and learn some lessons.
To me personally, the interesting thing is that some of your anecdotes are related to cricket. You must be a great cricket fan then.
Big cricket fan, WV. And therefore a big fan of people like yourself. Yeah. And you can imagine someone who's a cricket fan and thinks the world of coaches must think WV is someone special. Yeah.
You're being very kind, Prakash. You made great strides in your domain as well as a leadership coach. Now, do you, for me to get a better idea, do you train leaders on personal development or on business dynamics?
I tend to work a lot more on the person rather than on the business. So the idea here is that they would know their business best, and very often they are from fields where I might have no idea of what it takes to succeed in that specific field. But what I try and do is to help them to say, as leaders, how can they get it right? So what are some of the things they can do in terms of becoming better as leaders, building better teams? So it doesn't matter whether you're in a chemicals business or in technology. What I will try and do is to tell you or help you to become as good as you can be as a leader. And I leave the specifics of the business to you to decide. That's what I would do.
Over a period of time, what do you think are the strengths of business leaders? Where do you think they're really strong? Which areas?
One of the things that's happened, I think, in the last 15, 20 years, I think, and I would probably say post-liberalization, a lot of the younger people who've become leaders, I think, are very audacious. Maybe there was a generation of leaders before them who were scared. Their first instinct perhaps was, how do I make sure I don't lose, or how do I make sure I don't go bankrupt? Today's leaders, I think, are far more willing to bet on a big future. They're willing to take big bets. They're not scared. I think that's a big difference. They also think global. So perhaps in the good old days, a good leader would have been someone, he might have been selling spices in Calcutta, and he'd be very happy of spices in the East. But today, that kid will probably say, how can I take my spice business online? How can I be selling spices into the US? How can I build out a business which is not just spices? So I think the scale at which people have begun to dream has become much bigger. I would probably say that, and I said two good things about it, and one possible challenge, I think, is a lot of the leaders today grow up competing. They are constantly competing to get more, to be ahead of the class. How do I get 1 mark more than the other guy? How do I get into that college ahead of the other guy? How do I get that job ahead of someone else? Leaders need to recognize that at some stage they need to stop competing and start collaborating. And perhaps that is something that can sometimes be a bit of a challenge for some people.
So which are the areas you help them improve upon? Obviously, everybody cannot have all the attributes that are required. They are good in some areas, they are not so good in some. So which areas to help them improve?
So the way I look at it is, I try and say, what is it that a leader is really good at? So the idea is not to try and identify, this is wrong, and let me go and fix that, let me go and fix the other one. But to try and say, what are this leader's really big strengths? What are his or her towering strengths? And then try and say, if those are the strengths, how do we help this leader use or leverage those strengths to the fullest? And what happens when you do that is you find there are some speed breakers, there are some roadblocks, there are some behaviors which are perhaps holding that person back. And these could be anything from, somebody so smart that, while his team is on page 3 of a report, he's already on page 15. So what happens is he will tend to give everyone the answers. He will tell them what to do. Result, nobody in the team will grow. Nobody in the team will feel that, hey, this is our business, our decision. So what I try and do is to help that leader to then relate to the team, to try and understand what does it take to get other people to do well. And I think good leaders recognize that success eventually is not about how good they are, but about how good they manage to make other people around them. And how do you build great teams? How do you get an entire organization to get excited about whatever it is that you have as a dream? So I try and help leaders on trying to, help them leverage their strengths, iron out some of these weaknesses, but broadly on their own behavior, their own, small blind spots they might have, which they don't recognize, some quirks that they might have, which may be holding them back, and which can help them to become a lot more effective with teams, with other people, with their families too.
Yeah, apart from having to carry their team members along in order to achieve the objectives, what other attributes, according to you, make a great leader in business?
There are 3 or 4 things that most leaders tend to have in common. And the first one, I think, is a pretty good idea of a goal or a vision of where they want to go, where they want to be, and they are excited by it. And it's not often something which is here and now, but this ability to look into the distance, look at the future and say, wow, I think that's something that we can get. They get excited by it, and they get their teams to also get excited by it. So I think that's one. A second one, I think, is good leaders manage to kind of turn the spotlights away from themselves and onto the team. So they stop worrying about me, what do I need? What is my dream? To perhaps shift it to saying, how can I make this their dream? How can I make this something that my team is really excited about? I think that's something else that they do. And good leaders also manage to get the best out of other people. And I think that's a great trait to have, where you're not focused on saying, I'm the boss or I'm the leader. You will do what I tell you, or you will do it for me. They try and say, hey, you're my team. How can I help you to get better? How can I help you to deliver more? And I think that's something good leaders do. I think they also have a very strong bias for action. Sometimes you can get people who get very theoretical, who are constantly thinking, constantly worrying in their minds about, is this the right thing? And I'm sure you will find lots of sporting analogies on this one. But at the end of the day, if it's the last over of that game, if you're the captain, you've got to decide who will bowl that over. You can't be saying, let me come back. I've asked McKinsey to come and do a report for me. And when they give me the report, I will look at it and then decide what will happen. In that moment, you've got to take a decision, and you've got to be willing to live with failure. You can't be terribly scared that what if it goes wrong? Because if you get scared with what if it goes wrong, and that is something that can become a big problem for you, I think. So something else that you might want to watch out for. I think
what is this?
That's
what is
pretty
the
much.
Sorry. What is the style of leadership you generally come across in business?
I think there is a good mix of leaders, and I like the question, because what tends to happen, I think, is we tend to think of leaders as having one style. So either he's a Hitler, or he is Mother Teresa. So we tend to think of it as leaders will always have this one style. I think part of my job, or part of what I try and do as a coach, is to try and remind leaders that they have more than one style. They could have a dominant style, but their strength as a leader will depend on how can they flex the other muscle. So there will be situations where you will want to be this good person who's delegating everything and saying, come on, go and do it. Or you'll be this very supportive kind of leader in some situations. But there will be situations where you need to play Hitler, where you need to say, this is wartime. We have no time for debate and dissent. That's over. Now you will do what I tell you. And I think good leaders are people who tend to use more than one muscle, have more than one style, and tailor that style for a situation or for the person that they're talking to. The problem we have today, and since you asked about what kind of leaders do I find, I think a lot of leaders become successful because one style has worked for them. So they've been this fantastic person who can really push teams, who delivers results. I don't care what happens, I must get the result. It's okay when you do that once in a month, a couple of months early on in your life. But if that becomes a dominant style, then they think that this will work for them for the rest of their lives. And that can sometimes become a problem. So they need to kind of give up on some of what might have made them successful and try and adopt a style which might look alien to them, but might help them actually become better leaders.
Decision making is a critical factor in leadership. On a scale of 1 to 10, where will you stack the business leaders that you dealt with so far?
On decision making, I'd probably say they'd all be very, very high on that. They'd be upwards of 8. Probably, I'd probably say they'd more 8.5 and 9 on decision making. And I think that, let's say, is a bit like the table stakes for a good leader. You have to take a lot of decisions in your life, and good leaders know that if I take 10 decisions, I'll be lucky if 6 or 7 of them come good. But they will take a lot of decisions, and what will happen over time is that 10 becomes 100 and 7 becomes 70. So if you take 70 good decisions, your business is going to benefit. And if that's 100 becomes 1,000 and you've taken 700 good decisions, you will find that you make mistakes. But if you let the fear of that mistake hold you back, I think you won't make a great leader. So I would probably say one of the things leaders will do well typically is take good decisions.
Do some leaders even go through the fear of success? There's fear of failure. Do some go through fear of success as well?
That's an interesting question. So when you say fear of success, I'm guessing...
like the middle management, more success entails and brings along more responsibility. Do some people shy away from this?
Honestly, WV, I think that's a very old school. This used to happen maybe 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when perhaps some of us were growing up. We would hear stories of, this uncle who was a clerk in a bank and did not want to get promoted to becoming an officer because that would mean, longer hours at work or not being able to get X number of casual leave, etc., etc. I think young people today, and certainly this generation, is extremely ambitious. I think they want to do well, they want to succeed, and they're willing to work for it. So I would probably say that sometimes you have a situation where, it's like people think that they're running a race to win. And by the time they realize they're winning, they figure, hey, this is not the race I wanted to run. And that's a fear of success, I think, that can sometimes hit people, where they realize that, hey, I spent my life thinking this is what success is for me. And when you get there, you say, oh, wow, my idea of success was very, very different. This is not what I wanted. And that can be a situation perhaps where, they will kind of say, I'm not interested. I don't want this one. That can happen. But otherwise, one of the things that strikes me about young people and this generation of people coming into are extremely ambitious. I'd probably say almost to a fault. They're in a hurry. They're a generation in a hurry. They want success and they want it quick. But more often than not, I think it's a good thing. Ambition will drive you to work harder. Ambition will drive you to learn. Ambition will drive you to do different things to try and succeed, which can be a good thing for the country, I think.
Will the effects of this pandemic bring about a paradigm shift in leadership in the future, at least in the near future?
I think it will. Somebody said this, WV, that this pandemic, if it doesn't make you a better leader or a stronger leader, then you're dead. And that's a good question. That's a good question that all of us must ask ourselves. Some of us think this is that little break in the game, and that we can come back after the pandemic is over and go back to being the leader we were. And that, I think, is not going to be an option. If you haven't got better, if you haven't gotten stronger, you may not even be able to come back and lead. And I think that's a good way to look at it. What this pandemic has done, I think, is to tell all of us how we all had this grand 5-year plan and 10-year strategy. And, it used to be a very popular question all those years ago to say, where will we be in 2020? And none of us would have ever thought that we'll be here in 2020. And what this has taught us really is to say that it's not about saying that this is where I will be in X years, but saying, how do I build the capability that even as the world around me changes, I learn to adapt. I show that agility to keep learning, keep moving, keep turning my business around, and not being fixated on saying, this is my business and this is how I do it, because that will never work, I think. And that agility will, I think, make us better leaders and make us stronger leaders into the future. Unfortunately, the problem is it's a bit like, saying that he's a great batsman, but he's also going to be up against a terrific attack on a bad wicket. And that's probably what the pandemic has done to us. I think it's going to be tough times. It's not enough to have a great business idea or a good leader. I think you'll need a lot more to succeed in this future.
The humane factors were always there in decision making, but do you think it will have a bigger role given the uncertainties and the anxieties that people have been subjected to now?
I think it'll all get challenged. You're right. We've always thought of leaders as benevolent and humane, and the truth is, I think leaders will be asked to make hard calls. It won't be pleasant, it won't be easy, but they'll have to do it. And I think we are seeing this all around us, and there are enough stories of layoffs and furloughs and people losing their jobs and downsizing. And you sometimes wonder, does this leader even have a heart? And I think you've got to grant that sometimes leadership is also about taking those tough calls, which will hopefully allow the business to tide over these difficult times. Because if they don't take those calls today, it's quite likely, that the business may not be there 6 months from now or a year from now when things do get better. So as a leader, you've got to give yourself, your team, your organization, a chance to be in the game a year later when things get better. If you don't survive, it'll be tough. So I feel bad when I read all about those layoffs and furloughs, and I wonder, is there a better way? And I think I must tell you this, many organizations and many leaders have found a way. So it's not unusual to find that the leadership team is either saying, the leader says, I will not take a salary, or will take a 50% cut. And people at the bottom won't have to take a cut, or people will take a 15%, 20% cut. The idea is, how can we conserve cash? How can we control our spends now so that we are still around when things get better? And that's a tough call, but I think people need to take it.
The other big challenge is something of a catch-22 situation. Yes, you said the leader has to take a tough call. He has to lay off jobs if necessary. But after having done that, how is he going to motivate the existing people in his organization?
So I would probably say that how do you motivate your people is not something that you need to worry about when things go wrong. So it's not something like, oh my goodness, I have sacked people now, so my people will feel unhappy, so now I need to motivate them. I don't think that would work. If you have to motivate them, that should have started much earlier. And what good leaders do is that they are transparent. So trust. So they are vulnerable. They're willing to talk about what's working, what's not working. They communicate a lot. And more often than not, they make it clear that, hey, I've got your back. I'm going to try and do what's right for you. And then if push comes to shove, if I'm forced to take a decision where I need to let go of people, I will do it in a manner which is as less painful as is possible. So I will do it in a humane way. I will try and open some doors for you. I will give you time. I will try and create resources which can help you to find another job. So I think they will try and do it in a manner which still keeps people excited. Now, this is not to say that if you're in an organization where somebody else has lost his job, it's tough to stay motivated. But if you believe that your leader's heart is in the right place, if you trust your leader to do the right thing by the business, it becomes easier for you to accept that decision, put your head down and say, hey, let's get back to doing the things we need to do to take this business ahead. Hopefully, if we get it right, we'll be in a place where we can bring some of those people back. But the worst thing that happens is where if you are in a situation where you don't know what's happening, your leader's not talking to you, you are worried, everybody's living in fear, there is no place where you can ask those questions. Now that's a bad place, and no amount of motivating talk or anything will then change things for you. I think that's what will happen. So simple answer in this would be, I think the time to motivate your team is not when the chips are down. It's when you keep them motivated earlier, you let them trust you, and that will pay off when you get into trouble. That's what I think.
How easy or difficult is it going to be a sort of a Jekyll and Hyde? You've got to be ruthless in your decision making, yet you've got to be humane as well. How challenging is that going to be?
So I must add one more thing now to your earlier question, WV, about the traits of a leader. And I think one of the traits leaders learn to live with is what's often called the tyranny of and. So it's life is not choices of this or that very often. It's this and that. And it's not about saying that, I can either give you top line growth, or I can give you bottom line growth, or I can give you, great business from a shareholder standpoint, or I will give you an organization where people are happy. So these are not discrete choices. I think good leaders recognize it is a bit of this and that. And I think that is similar. And I talked about it to say that good leaders have this ability to actually play those dual roles. And it's not Jekyll and Hyde in the sense of one or the other at any point in time, but saying, how do I, have that iron fist and the velvet glove, as it were? Or how do I ensure that I am humane and I show my heart in the things that I do? But when it comes to taking a call, I don't let my heart come in the way of the right decision. And many leaders, and I must confess that some of us could also say we were guilty of it, but very often the mistake you can make as a leader is to allow emotion to interfere with a good decision. And you must remember, at the end of the day, it's not about your emotion, your personal relationship that you run this business for. It's because you have a job to do, you've got a business to run, you've got shareholders to take care of, you've got employees to take care of. And I think you've got to be willing to take the right decision, even if sometimes it's hard on you personally to take that decision. Tell me, has it happened to you that you see all this happening as a coach, where you have this player who you like a lot, she or he's doing a great job, but you're forced to drop that person on a big game because you just think that from a team perspective, that person is not required? And I saw, for example, Stuart Broad getting dropped and cursing everybody right now, saying, I think this is the end of the world. I can't understand the decision. But, I'm guessing that the coach or the captain will take a decision which they say is good for the team, rather than worry about what that individual might need.
It happens, yes, I do agree, but the repercussions are different in sport and in a corporate world. We'll have to talk about more in depth when we come across each other in person. And now, can the leaders expect their employees to be ultra sensitive, easily excited, frustrated even?
I think so. I think it's a truth of our times that people will be on a short fuse. People will tend to worry about things, and we are in an uncertain time. I think there's also all the stress. It's nice and easy for some of us to talk about the pleasures of working from home and not having to waste time commuting, and being able to be in your pajamas with. But I think you must also think of work from home from the perspective of that employee, who's probably got children, bawling and crying out there, and parents around, and maybe a sister-in-law also over there, and all of them trying to share a small one-bedroom apartment, and that can become tough. And I think we all need to show a lot more empathy. I think the more progressive organizations and the more progressive leaders are already taking the effort to perhaps counsel employees, to keep the lines of communication open, so that if there is a concern, if people have a problem, they can speak about it and they can try and find solutions to it, rather than thinking that I have to fight this problem on my own. And I think one of the big lessons coming out of this pandemic for leaders, for team members, for organizations, I think is we should stop thinking of this as a war where I am against the world. I think we've got to try and say, how do we all get together? How can we find allies? How can we find partners, collaborators? And I think that can help. So if somebody has a problem, I think it's extremely important for that person to be able to reach out and talk to other people and try and find solutions, I think.
It will take an all-round view when things get back to normal, at least in terms of offices getting back to normal, working with 100% capacity. Now, where would you advise a leader to start, and where does he focus more now upon resumption of play?
I think there would be a couple of things, which is I'm hoping that even before resumption of play, people have been planning for what the resumption is. I think it would be a very poor leader if you now suddenly say, okay, now that office is open, now what should we do? So I'm hoping there's been some level of homework that's happened. I would probably focus on maybe three levels on this one. I think the first would be to try and get speed. How do I make it look like we are getting back to normal? And sometimes it can mean, how do I tell customers, how do I tell my partners that we are back and things are going to be back to normal, or we're pushing to get back to normal? So I think one of the things in a situation like this is, if you stay down too long, it becomes more and more difficult for you to climb back up. So I think it's important for you, even if it's small baby steps, I think it's important for all of us to make that effort to climb. People must see the angle and say, I think we are beginning to see a recovery. We are beginning to see that line moving up. So I think that's one big one I would probably want to say. I think the second one, I think, would be to try and think of this as a team, as a network of teams. So don't think you're a leader and you need to take all the decisions. I think appoint leaders in your team, appoint different people to take on different responsibilities and let them run with it. They'll be closer to the problem. They'll be closer to understanding what the ground level reality is, and let people take decisions. And I think this whole idea of localization, delegation will, I think, just get bigger because of what's happening now. And that would be the second one I would do. And the third, I think, would be to try and say, what do we need to change so that we are in the race in a world that has changed? So I think you've got to be willing to let go of the ways of doing business. You might think that our strength has been this bit, so if you're a FMCG company, you might say, my strength has been the fact that we sell to 2 million outlets in India, and that, let me see any competitor, how can he build a 2 million outlet network? The truth is, maybe that's irrelevant now, because suddenly people will buy online. So you've got to be telling yourself, am I gearing this business to win online? Am I gearing, if you're a restaurant, am I gearing for takeaways? If you're in any business, you've got to say, how will we change, and how do I demonstrate the willingness to change so that in a new world, we are still relevant? That's important, I think.
You were talking about the importance of having to, have people to counsel generally in companies now, to counsel the employees. Now, have you come across business leaders who themselves have had some mental problems to tackle with during this pandemic, during this lockdown?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it's a pandemic is pretty non-discriminating in that sense. And I think some of the problems that we all have, it's tempting to think it's only for me and it's not for the other person. The truth is, it's affecting everybody. And so what I said to you about, let's say, counseling employees is as true. And I think leaders need to drop this veneer or this facade of saying that I am so strong, I am Superman, nothing happens to me. That's not true. And no, for the leader, if she or he tries to maintain that facade. So it's a good idea to be able to say, I need help. I've often thought good leaders are very quick to say two things. One, I don't know. So they don't think they need to be know-it-all, or that it's a shame if the leader doesn't know. They're very comfortable saying, I don't know. And the second one is they say, I need help. And I think if you say, I need help, chances are you'll get it. And you'll be surprised that you'll get help from the most unexpected quarters. So it's a good idea to seek help for everybody.
So how are they going to address it when it comes to themselves, and what are they going to do in your mind when they start operations in full swing? Now, this has become a situation where more or less you need to devote a lot of time in that direction.
Yeah. I think they will have to, like I said, get people together, get everybody to get engaged, maybe over communicate, reach out, but also start taking some baby steps to progress. And I think very often what happens is that you can define success as being back to where we were pre-COVID. And that can look very, very far away. So I think it's important for you to define success in smaller steps and try and say, what are the small steps that we will take? I think a big question leaders will need to answer for themselves and for their business is, what has changed for us and how have we changed? How are we preparing to change? So I think the whole idea of a change agenda, which could mean changing the focus for the business, which might mean pivoting the business from doing one thing to doing another, changing the way you might be doing business, letting go of what you might have thought was a strength and being quick to say that may not be a strength anymore. So I think it's almost like reassessing the terrain, understanding how the ground has shifted, and then saying, okay, now I know what we need to do to win in a new world. So it's almost, think of leaders as these people standing with a whiteboard with a pen in their hand. And I think what you will find now is that leaders are not the guy with a pen in the hand, but with a duster in their hand or an eraser in their hand, but they're actually cleaning that board out and saying, hey, we've got a fresh slate now, and let's try and understand in this fresh new world, in this new normal, what will we now do to win? That might be what will help leaders to get it right.
We both know that intent does not always result in implementation. How are you going to convince leaders to implement their intentions, however noble they are, but sometimes they cannot get to the stage of implementing them?
I think what happens in situations like these is that it's no longer an option. I think you have a choice. Either you will do it or you'll be dead. And you will quickly realize that one of the things that will happen also is timelines will change, tolerance levels, patience will I think be at a premium, and therefore people will discover that they need to move, they need to get moving quickly. And it's like I said, it's not necessarily about saying that every step you take will take you in the right direction. But the worst thing that can happen for you is that you're not taking steps and you're waiting for things to happen, and that's just not an option. So I think you will find that leaders are implementing. I also feel that in good organizations, pressure builds up from within. So it's not about this, this comic book where there is one leader, one hero who will have to do everything and the world will get sorted out. It's about a series of leaders. It's about leaders across the spectrum, across the system, and people will push. There will be enough, system momentum to make the leader react, move, and get things done. Sure, mistakes will get made, but I think action will get taken, and people will need to learn on the fly. So take a step. If it's wrong, correct it. But don't be so scared that this may be wrong, so you don't take any step at all. Don't let that happen. That's what I would say, and I think people will take those steps.
Talking of mistakes on a personal level, what mistake has taught you the most valuable lesson?
What mistake has taught me the most valuable lesson? So it's something we might have talked about a little bit, WV, just some time back. So as a leader, I tended to be this kind of person who loved to take the team along. So for me, it was not just about someone at work, but his family also became friends with me. So, so I would that meant a lot to me, getting people excited, getting people to be passionate about what's happening. I remember once, I had to take a decision where I had to get rid of a colleague, someone who worked with me, and we had to take a tough call. So there was pressure from headquarters that we need to kind of let this person go. Results weren't coming. And I was saying, come on, it's not just if he's this one person who's not able to get it right. Sure, we're not getting results, but maybe there's some other problem. And why don't we help him? And, all of you sitting in head office, if you think you know how to solve the problem, come help him to solve the problem. But that didn't happen. And until it reached a stage where we had to let him go. And I was pretty sad that I had to do that. But as I look back now, I think it was a mistake. The mistake I made was, I think I delayed it too much because we moved him out. And I almost felt people saying, what took you so long? Couldn't you see that there's a problem here? And the problem actually did get solved. And what I really learned are two things. One, of course, never delay these decisions. And if there's a problem, uh, take your time. Don't be in a hurry to take a decision, but don't delay it because it is difficult for you to do it. And for me, I must confess, it was difficult. I was worried, that here is this man who's a good friend, whose little 6-year-old son thinks the world of me. And I was worried that, he'll be having breakfast the next day and his mother will say, that uncle you thought was a good man, he just, put your dad out of a job. That worried me. And I think it's a bad one. You shouldn't let that happen. You should take that tough call. The good news is that at the end of it, that man went on to do something else and did extremely well. So he was very successful. We are still friends. And therefore, there's a small lesson in it for all of us, I think, that don't, if it's a hard decision, that's not reason enough not to do it. It may be hard, but you got to do it. And things will generally work out well if you do the right thing. Just do the right thing. That's what matters.
Finally, your view on the cliche, leaders are born.
No. I think this whole idea, and somebody said this, that leaders have first to be born, only then they can be made. So if he's not born, he would not have been made. But having said that, I'm a big believer, WV, that we can all get better. We all want to get better. And, it's a very poor view to say that you are like that. It's also a myth that leaders have to be these charismatic, great communicator. What a man. People see him and say, wow, kya leader hai. That's not true. Some of the best leaders in the world have been introverts, shy, very reclusive, but they had their heart in the right place. They cared about people. They had a good idea for the business. They knew what they wanted to do. So I think people can get better, and you can help people to get better. And I don't like this idea that, if you're clumsy, you have two options. One is that you can try and say that I will get better. I will not be clumsy. I will be careful. Or you can say, what to do. I'm a Sagittarian, so I'm clumsy. So for the rest of your life, you will live a life saying, I'm Sagittarian, I'm clumsy, so be it. And I think that's not the way to live. Yeah. I think we all deserve a chance to try and become the best version of ourselves. And I think leaders can be made as easily as that. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Prakash. It was a pleasure chatting to you, and thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, WV. It's such a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for having me here. I can tell my grandchildren that I was on a show which had Kapil Dev and Azhar along with WV someday. But thank you so much for having me here. Really appreciate it.
Cheers. That's it for tonight, viewers. And the next episode is going to feature a very special guest. I'm sure you would all join us on Friday evening. Until then, take care. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also allow for the notifications to be sent to you as well. Good night. And once again, keep well and stay safe and stay at home as much as possible. Only venture out when you have to. Good night. God bless.